Okay. All right. Well, here we are today with our fourth session, just focusing on reviewing the topics to prepare for the various assignments. So I'm glad to see you guys are working on those. I want to encourage you to keep doing that. And then just as today, a few of you had questions, which is great. So you're always welcome to ask me any specific questions you want about your assignments. So today, what I'd like to try to accomplish is to do the review for the next assignment. We've looked at assignment 4.9, 10, and 11. Assignment 4.9 is the first one, the read and observe the book. That was for Zechariah, to read and observe the book of Zechariah. Then the second assignment we looked at was assignment 4.10, which was the background context of Zechariah and filling that in. And then last time we met, we discussed the assignment 4.11, which is the contextual flow of the book. And this morning, I'd like to focus our attention on the next assignment, which is the key assignment for the prophetic genre, and that is to examine the prophetic analysis, to do the prophetic analysis for the book. And this again would be, not the book, for your passage. Okay, so the first three assignments focus attention on the book. Okay, read and observe the book. So you're going to do that for the whole book of Zechariah. Okay, and again, the assignments have the details of what I'm looking for. So you have an example in each assignment. And the same will be the case for this next assignment, assignment 4.12, which is the prophetic analysis of the assignment of your passage. I should put that, of the passage. Okay, so these next steps are just focusing attention on the passage. And again, each of these, after the prophetic analysis, the other steps are the same that we've done before. Okay, so the prophetic analysis, again, that's the unique step in studying the prophetic genre. If you'll remember, the fourth step, after studying the book in narratives, the fourth step was narrative analysis. After studying the book for poetry, the fourth step is poetic analysis. And then after studying the prophetic books, the fourth step is the prophetic analysis. Now for epistles, again, we don't have this fourth step. We just jump right to the diagram of the passage, all right? So epistles are, that one last step. But for prophecy, we have this prophetic analysis. So I'd like to do this morning, I just want to remind you of what that includes, and then look at Obadiah again as an example of that. And then we'll take a quick look at the assignment, make sure that hopefully it makes sense to you what's required. Okay. So before we get started, are there any questions that you guys have, that anybody has? All right. Well, if any of you do, just interrupt or raise your hand or just get my attention if any question comes to your mind. All right. Again, the goal of the first three steps, all right, is the book, as I said. Same for epistles, same for narratives, same for poetry, wisdom literature. The goal of the first three steps is understand the book as a whole, right? The occasion of the book, what prompted it to be written. That comes from the background context. Then the purpose of the book, that is, what is the author's flow of thought? That's the literary context, or we also call it the contextual flow of the book. All right. Now, once the author's occasion and purpose have been identified, now you can focus attention on your passage. And the passage level analysis, again, is step 4. And that is the prophetic analysis. And these are what is involved to do the prophetic analysis. There's a few steps here. It's the same as we saw for narratives. There are several steps that we did for narratives. There are several steps for poetry. If you remember narratives, we would do the character analysis, the setting analysis, the scene analysis, and the plot. For poetry, we would do setting and structure of the poem. We would then do the parallelism in the poem. We would then do the imagery, then the poetic devices. So those were the focus of particular steps for poetry. For prophecy, these are the steps involved in prophetic analysis. The first step is to read and observe the passage. Now, here's where you'll focus attention just on your passage. So, for example, if your your passage is Zechariah chapter 2, then you will focus attention on just chapter 2 of Zechariah. You'll read through the chapter, just chapter 2 this time, not the whole book. You've already done that. But now we'll do read and observe again. This time, just read through the passage several times and make observations. So if, for example, your assigned passage was Zechariah 2, you would have these 13 verses from chapter 2, and you just read through it several times, again, to get more familiar just with your passage, and then make observations. I would recommend, to spend at least 15 minutes and just, again, make observations, general observations, just what things do you see in the passage. All right. And that's intended to get you familiar with your specific passage, more familiar with it. Then secondly, perform the narrative or poetic analysis on the passage. And notice I say where applicable. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, again, remember that the prophetic genre includes, it can be a mixture of genres, right? You may have sermons, you may have poetry, you may have narrative features. And so you first need to look at your passage and ask yourself, okay, what is the type of literature here? How is this being presented? And notice in Zechariah 2, this is really has narrative features. Okay, there's dialogue here between Zechariah and an angel who was speaking with him. And so that's a narrative kind of feature. So you're going to want to take note of that, and then kind of ask yourself, okay, there's not really a plot here. It's a vision. It's revealing some vision, and there's a meaning to the vision, but there is dialogue here. There are characters here. So we would want to at least look at the characters. We want to identify the setting. Okay, where is this being described? And even scenes. Sometimes there may be more than one scene, but in this case, there's not really a plot. There's not like a problem and then a solution necessarily. Sometimes there will be. Jonah would be a well-known narrative in a prophetic book. But for like visions, often the vision is kind of like a parable in that it's a picture of something, and there is a main point to it. But you wouldn't do all of the narrative analysis necessarily. You want to just focus on the characters, the setting, and the scenes, perhaps. And I'll show you an example in a minute. And we went through this in class. So if you go to your syllabus for the class, we went through this for Haggai. Haggai was something similar. There was just 4 messages that Haggai delivered to the people. So there was a little bit of narrative in Haggai, if you remember, in chapter 1, when, again, there's a little bit of dialogue, but then when you get to chapter 12, there's sort of narrative features here describing the people obeying and going back and building the temple. But there's not like a full plot and all of that. So you would just take note of, there's some narrator comments here. So you just take note of those comments that are mentioned. So that would be the only kind of narrative analysis you would do. And this is what makes it challenging with prophetic books, is you need to have some discernment to decide, okay, what kind of analysis do I need to do here? Do I need to do like a full narrative with characters and setting and scene and plot, or is there just some narrative features that I want to take note of? So like if there's a dialogue, like in Habakkuk, it's just a dialogue between the Lord and Habakkuk. So you're not going to have a plot there, but you do want to take note that, okay, there are, two characters here. They're having a dialogue with each other. And what are some of the important points or statements made in the dialogue? All right. So you have to show some discernment as to what you're going to be looking for and reviewing in that analysis. Same for poetry. Let's say you have a passage and it's poetic. All right. What are some of the elements that we look for in poetry? What are things that we try to discover, right? Well, there's parallelism, but possibly there's definitely imagery. There are poetic devices, right? Figures of speech, perhaps other poetic devices. So those are things you're going to want to look for in this particular step. You look at the passage and say, oh, this is poetic. So I need to identify the poetic features of this passage. All right. And that could include parallelism, imagery, poetic devices would be part of that. So this second step, if you will, in prophetic analysis will take a little bit of thought as to what you need to notice. All right. And like I said, I showed you one example for Haggai in class. We'll take a look at Obadiah here in a few moments, and I'll try to show you an example of this. All right, so that's the second step for prophetic analysis. The third step is to identify the time frame of the passage. That is the passage speaking of present events, of past events, or future events? All right, in the prophetic genre, it's not always talking about the future. In fact, some passages don't mention the future at all. Others do. Often you will see a mixture. You'll see, most likely, there are parts in the prophetic book which are past tense, something that the people have done. And then there are usually some present tense, what God is doing now or what's happening to the people now. And then there may be future tense, what will take place, either a promised blessing or promised consequence. And so you'll need to just take note of that for your passage. Is your passage a past or present or future, or is there a mixture? Okay, so that's the third step, is to identify that. The fourth one is to identify the type of prophetic genre. And again, remember, there's a judgment oracle, salvation oracle, and a form of judgment oracle called apocalyptic. All right, those are the three types of prophetic genre we discussed. Judgment oracles are just that. It's a statement of judgment. You'll see woe or something like that as part of the judgment oracle. The salvation oracle are just oracles which describe promises of deliverance or promises of blessing or restoration or those kinds of things. So kind of the good news oracles, if you will. And then the apocalyptic are those judgment oracles that are a special class, if you'll remember, that are very fanciful, otherworldly, just very vivid, mass destruction usually, that kind of thing. Okay. So that's the third step, is just simply to identify that type of prophetic genre that you see in the passage. Thirdly, identify what appears to be symbolic, that should be language. Okay, we discuss figurative language if you're looking at poetry. Symbolic language just means is there something or some things in the passage that seem to be intentionally symbolic. That is, that it's a symbol, it represents something else. All right, like Zechariah 6, there's a crown being described in the chapter, and that crown represents the coming Messiah who will be a priest and a king. And so the crown symbolized that future Messiah. In Haggai, at the end, Zechariah is called the signet ring of God. So that was a symbol. It's not just a figure of speech, but actually it symbolizes something God was going to do in the future. I think it was a messianic type of symbol. Okay, so that's symbolic language. I'm going to give you a few more details in a moment. Next is identify how does the passage fit within the author's flow of thought. So how does your passage connect to what came before and what came after? And then finally, and this one's important, the last step, note if your passage is cited or alluded to anywhere else in Scripture. Is your passage specifically quoted somewhere else in the Bible, either in the New Testament or in some cases that could be referred to in the Old Testament? And so it could be a direct quote or could be alluded to. That is a loose quote or connection. So you just want to take note of that. So you use a cross-reference or something to find that. Okay. So these are the 6 steps. I actually give a few more details of them. I'll put these in your notes, but I just sort of went through these. Read and observe. Take at least 30 minutes or so to read and observe, make general observations of the passage, and then perform the poetic or narrative analysis as applicable. So if it's a narrative, again, it might be a full story like Jonah, and there you would do a full narrative analysis, setting, scene, character, and plot analysis. But like I said, at times prophetic messages are given in the form of visions or images which have elements of a narrative but are not a full narrative. That is, they're not a full story with a plot intended. Okay, so in those cases, just do identify or note particular narrative features that you see. And then, as I said earlier, if it's poetry, if the passage is poetic, then look to see if there's parallelism and identify it, identify the imagery and the poetic devices, the figurative language. And then in many cases, you may have the prophetic passage that you have may actually be more of a sermon, which is direct instruction, similar to an epistle, and you wouldn't require any additional analysis in this step. Okay. Now, sometimes though, and you see this in Zechariah is going to have this, where there's, or we saw it in some of the prophetic books, where there may be narrative features like a dialogue or narrator or some event being described, like in a vision. But then you also might have poetic language used. So you'd have to sort of do both. Habakkuk would be one example of this. Habakkuk is, a well-known prophetic message. It's a dialogue between God and Habakkuk. And notice the dialogue uses poetic language. So you have narrative features, sort of this dialogue exchange between God and Habakkuk, but you also have poetic features. So you're going to need to you would need to go through, and do you see parallelism there? What poetic devices do you see? What images do you see? All right, so sometimes there can be, you might have a mixture of these things that you need to pay attention to. All right. That's the second step. I already mentioned the third, which is to identify the time frame of the passage. Is it past, present, or future? And again, note any time markers that you might see. And then fourthly, again, what's the type of prophetic genre? We discussed that: judgment oracle, salvation oracle, or apocalyptic. Identify what appears to be symbolic language. And I had a pretty long discussion about this. You can go back to your syllabus and go through the details, but identifying symbols is not easy. So these were some of the steps that I described in class that we discussed. First, be prayerful, of course, anytime you're studying, but especially in the prophetic genre, just asking the Lord for direction and insight. And then, a lot of times the text, as you're reading it, and you have to ask yourself, is this literal or figurative? What's being said here? And if it is figurative, then you have to ask, well, does this thing symbolize something? Is it meant to point to something else? And often the way to figure that out is look in the text itself. If it's symbolic, often the passage will tell you that. I mentioned Zechariah 6 earlier. After the last vision, God tells Zechariah to take silver and gold and make a crown and put it on the head of Joshua, the high priest. Now, this is literal. And notice, by the way, this is narrative, right? God's giving him instruction. And so he tells him to have a crown made of silver and gold, put it on the head of Joshua. Now, what is odd about that? Why would this be odd to put a crown on Joshua, the high priest? Anybody? What is strange about that?
Because he's not the king.
Yeah, he's not the king. He's a priest. But notice, so you say, oh, that's strange. And then you might ask, is this supposed to symbolize something? And then notice what verse 12 says. Then say to him, that's Joshua, thus says Yahweh of hosts, behold, a man whose name is Branch. So now he's pointing to Joshua with the crown on his head, the high priest with the crown, and he says, this man represents somebody. Okay, so now we see, Joshua actually with the crown is a symbol. And this somebody will build the temple of the Lord and will bear honor and sit and rule on his throne in the temple. Which that too would be odd, right? Because the throne is normally in the king's palace, not in the temple. But notice, here's the point of the symbol. Joshua with the crown on his head symbolizes this coming branch who will be a priest on his throne. So he will be a priest and a king. And then they were told to put the crown in the temple as a reminder of this prophecy of the coming Messiah. And again, here we see this is a symbol because the text reveals it, that Joshua here with the crown on his head is pointing to another man in the future. He's a picture of another man in the future whose name is Branch. Okay, that word branch or sprout, right? I think, by the way, is this, let me see here. What verse are we looking at again? Verse 12. Says, the Lord, behold, Yahweh, whose his name Zamak, okay, is branch or shoot. So Joshua here is a symbol with the crown on his head, and then the crown was left in the temple as a reminder. Again, it served as a symbol of this coming Messiah who would be both priest and king. All right, so all that to say is look for identification of the symbol within the text itself. And usually you will see some reference to it. Zechariah 4, the picture of the lampstand being fed by oil. And then at the end, and in the lampstand, there's two people, there's two olive trees there in the lampstand, and they represent two particular people. Okay, so again, we are told in the text that the olive trees are symbols. They are a literal olive tree, but it's an olive, it's meant to represent or point to something else. Just like the crown was a literal crown, and Joshua was the literal high priest in that day, and they put the crown on his head, but that was that was symbolic. It was meant to point to something else. And the same here in Zechariah 4. Those two olive trees are symbolic because the text tells us these two represent something else. So that's what you're looking for. All right. Any questions so far? Hopefully this is just reviewing, or hopefully stirring up your memory of what we talked about before, but do you have a question at this point? Okay.
Hello.
Mario, you have a
But
question? Yeah.
Yes, sir. But this event, sir, they actualized the crowning of Joshua.
Yeah, that was to actually be done. God told him to do it. He wasn't making Joshua king in that day. But he did want him to actually do it, right? Because he tells him, he commands him, take silver and gold, make a crown and put it on the head of Joshua. And then say to him, so this is what Zechariah was supposed to do. Speak to Joshua, and then basically say, behold a man. So Zechariah actually did this, or was commanded to do this. All right. So to actually make the crown, put it on his head, and then declare these words. And in that moment, Joshua will be a symbol of the coming Messiah who would be priest and king. So now this text is not telling us that he did it or when he did it, but this passage is just telling us how God instructed him to do it. Okay.
Then my follow-up question, sir.
Yeah.
The reference of that crown, sir, is a branch. Then another reference is two olive branch. Why two olive branch?
Oh, those are two different.
Olives.
Yeah, those are two different visions. Well, this is not a vision. This is an instruction. And the branch is actually Joshua represents the branch. So it's Joshua with the crown on his head represents the Messiah, the branch. Okay. In the vision in Zechariah 4, there were two olive trees in the vision.
Yeah.
And those represented something else. Some believe they represent the offices of the priest and the king. Okay, but it's a different vision. Okay, Zechariah 4 is a vision. Zechariah 6 is an actual event that Zechariah is being told to do. But my point was, in both of those visions, we see an example of a symbol. And again, we could go to Haggai 2 at the end, when, remember, the word of the Lord came to Haggai, speak to Zerubbabel, tell him I'm going to shake the heavens, overthrow the thrones. And on that day, verse 23, I will take you, Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, my servant, and I will make you like a signet ring, for I have chosen you. So on that day, speaking of the end times, he would take, and here we realize that Zerubbabel must be a symbol, because Zerubbabel is dead. This day hasn't happened yet, the final judgment. So Zerubbabel must be a symbol of, and of course we would say the Messiah, because he will be reign as king in that day. So Zerubbabel, in this case, we know he's a symbol because he's not actually alive right now, but he is in the line of the Messiah. And so this promise is essentially made to a descendant of Zerubbabel that he would reign in the place of the king as king, because Yahweh chose him. Okay, that
Pastor
one's
Tim,
yeah, Noor.
would it be the same case with the priest Joshua?
What
That,
about him?
Yeah, it wouldn't be the same case of Zerubbabel. And so Joshua now is not the priest or the king at the same time. It was just a feature.
Well, Joshua, if you're talking about Zechariah 6, Joshua was meant to be a picture or a symbol representing the coming Messiah. All right. And so this in Zechariah 6, Joshua with the crown on his head is a symbol. That means Joshua is not the king, nor will he be the king, but he is a picture, right? The priest with the crown means he's a picture of one who will be a priest and king. So he's just a symbol. He's not the actual thing. Just like Zerubbabel, it won't actually be Zerubbabel who's the signet ring, but he's a symbol of one who will be. So actually, in both cases, they're pointing to the same person, but God's using a different person as a symbol in each case. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, good question. Now, like in Daniel, I think we looked at this one in class, Daniel 7, right? We had Daniel's vision of the beasts, right? And one was like a lion, another like a leopard and a bear. And, they had these, and in that particular vision, later on, I think it's verse 17, these beasts are described, and we learn that these beasts are symbols of nations, coming nations. And so the beast was an actual beast in the vision, but the beast represented something else, that symbolized something else. In Daniel 7, it's described what it symbolizes. And that's what you're often going to see. If there's a symbol, then there'll be something in the passage that will give us direction as to what it symbolizes, what it represents, or what it points to. Usually you don't have to go to a bunch of other verses and try to figure it out. Normally, within the text, there will be an indication. Unless it's like an obvious symbol, like a crown. That obviously is represents a king, right? So in that passage, we shouldn't be shocked, that to realize the crown is representing a king, but in that passage, it's representing a specific king, the coming Messiah. So, but there'll often be clues in the text that will tell you it's a symbol and tell you what it is representing or symbolizing. Okay? If you can't figure it out from the passage, then it may not be a symbol. All right?
Sir, can I interrupt again, sir?
Yeah.
Since we quote that one branch, it is a singular, sir. Then the other one, two anointed ones, it seems like plural because there the word two.
Right.
Can you explain me, sir, once again, so that I
Well, you have to go through the passage there. I don't have time to go through the whole prophecy there
Yep.
and what they
because
represent two offices, most like
thank you,
priest
sir.
and king.
The more
A
the more
priest and a
I
king. Yeah.
the more it clearer, sir.
Yeah.
Thank you, sir.
No, it's a good question. I'm just trying to give you guys some examples which show you that usually the passage will tell you if something is being used as a symbol. And usually the passage will give you some idea of what it symbolizes. Sometimes it's a little less clear. And it may be less clear for a couple reasons. One is just because it's not really a symbol. All right. Like, for example, one passage that's commonly Zechariah 1, and I can't remember. Some of you might, a couple of you might have this passage. The first vision that Zechariah has is of these horses patrolling the earth, right? One's red, one's white, one's sorrel, like maybe mixed colors. And there's all this discussion about what each of those symbolizes. But it's like, you know what? There's really no clue in the passage that tells us that these are symbols of something. They could simply just be horses that look different. Okay? Is it possible they are symbolic? Yes, it is. But if it's not obvious, if there's no clear, because notice when Zechariah asks, my Lord, what are these? He knows they're horses, but he's asking, what's the significance of this picture? And he says, I'll show you what these are. And then he just describes them as going out and patrolling the earth. Okay? He doesn't talk about one waging war and another, So some people do that. Red represents the color of violence and bloodshed. Well, it can, but is that what it's doing here? I don't think there's enough clues in the passage to tell us that we can say that the colors of the horses represent something. So just be careful. Just because it's a prophetic text doesn't mean everything in the passage is symbolic of something. That's the same mistake that people make when they interpret parables. They look at a parable and then they make everything in the parable represent something, right? We talked about the Good Samaritan before, right? Where the Good Samaritan, the classic interpretation from Augustine and others was the Good Samaritan represented Adam, the robber was Satan, the Levite was the Old Testament law, the priest was the Levite was the Mosaic covenant, the priest was the law. I can't remember everything. The inn represented the church. Of course, the Samaritan was Jesus. So everything in the parable represents something. And you read the parable and you go, well, how would we know this? What are there's no clues to tell us this. You see that? It's made up. Okay, the point of that parable was simply Jesus wanted to tell a story which would make clear how we are to be a neighbor to others. How are we to show love to others, right? Not, this big fanciful, and we see this, parables are interpreted this way, where everything in the parable signifies something. And I think a lot of times prophetic passages, people do the same thing. Are there symbols in prophetic passages? Yes, there are. But often there's some clue in the text that will tell us that it's symbolic. And often there will be an explanation of what the symbol is, what it means. Sometimes there isn't. And so often in that case, it could be that the symbol is something so common, like the people of the audience of the prophet's day would have recognized that it represented something. Like in our culture, there's certain things that are symbolic. Or, you know, represent their icon of a key event. A cross is a symbol, isn't it? It represents something. The cross represents salvation, doesn't it? The cross doesn't, like the actual cross on your neck or on a building doesn't save you, but it's a symbol of what Jesus died on, and that act of death can bring salvation, right? So the cross became a symbol of the saving work of Christ because he died on a cross. So there are certain things, and then there's things in cultures that people know are represent something else. Well, that could be the case sometimes in these prophetic passages where the people of in the days of the prophet would recognize the meaning of a particular symbol. All right. And that's where you may have to do some study of the Old Testament to see what other places is that particular object seen and what does it represent. But normally there's going to be some direction given to you in the passage. Okay? Does that make sense? Hopefully. Symbols are tough, but I think it's not as hard as it needs to be if you just are paying attention to the passage and seeing what's in the passage. Someone had a question or comment? Okay. Let's keep going. What is the context of the passage containing the symbolism? Again, we pretty much, that's exactly what we've been talking about. And then another one that's helpful in interpreting symbols is what is the main point of the picture the prophet's describing? So for example, we use the Zechariah 6, right? The picture was Joshua the high priest with a crown on his head. Okay, that's normally kings wear a crown, but here the high priest is wearing a crown. So the main point of the picture seems to be the high priest with the crown on his head is representing something. And in fact, in this case, it's explained who he's representing. Okay. But that's the idea is what's the picture that symbol, what would be the main point of that picture? And it's often explained or described. I think this part's similar. What appears to be the purpose of the symbol? Again, that is often described. Now, the same symbol in different texts does not always refer to the same thing. I mentioned the horses here in Zechariah 1. Horses are again mentioned in Zechariah 6. And then we see horses later in Revelation 6. Just because we see horses of different colors in each of those passages, don't assume they represent the same things. All right, they could, but you need to do further study. Don't assume it. That's another thing I see often happens, where if you see a similar symbol or picture in two different passages, that's assumed to be the same thing. That's not always the case. Okay. All right. All right, so after you identify the symbol and what it seems to be referring to, then the next thing to do in a prophetic passage analysis is indicate how the passage fits in the author's flow of thought. So you have your particular text. Let's say you're studying Zechariah 6 and this passage with the crown. You want to ask yourself, or you want to identify, okay, what happened before this? And how does it connect? And in this case, in Zechariah, it's kind of interesting. Chapter 1 begins with a short sermon, really just a few verses. And then, and you're going to want to pay attention, guys. This is talking about the structure of Zechariah, which is in one of your assignments. So you have the introduction, then you have the 8 visions, chapters 1 to 6. Okay. And then you have at the end of those 8 visions, this instruction by God to Zechariah to build a crown and put it on the head of Joshua. That is sort of a summary of the point of those visions and what they were pointing to. So that story at the end of Zechariah 6 is actually linked to the visions that Zechariah was given. Okay, so if you're studying Zechariah 6, you're going to want to pay attention to, okay, what came before and what's the connection? Zechariah 6 is talking about the coming Messiah. And guess what? Who was the focus in those 8 visions? Right? So you want to ask, how's my passage connected to what's around it? And of course, we're supposed to do that with any passage we study, right? So it's the same thing with the prophetic. These aren't randomly chosen events that have no connection. No, actually, just like in a narrative, just like in an epistle, the book is put together by the author where there's a flow of thought through the book. And so an author may present one sermon and then another sermon and then another, and in some way they're linked together. Okay. So at this particular step in the prophetic analysis, you're simply identifying how it connected to what came before and what comes after. And then lastly, as I said, the last one is to just note if your passage that you're studying is referenced, quoted, or even alluded to elsewhere in Scripture. So if we are studying Zechariah 1 with the horses, we may want to look at Zechariah 6 or especially Revelation 6 and see if there are any connection there between the horses there and the horses here. Is in Revelation 6, does there appear to be a direct quote from something in Zechariah 1? Okay. Now, there are some cases, right? For example, where there's a direct quote. So if you're in Acts 2, right? Peter quotes directly from Joel chapter 2. So if you're studying Joel 2, you would want to take note of this, that Joel 2 is referred to in Acts, and there Peter seems to be, and so you'll just want to give some comment about how the passage is used in the place that it's quoted. All right, or if you're like Habakkuk 2:4, right? The righteous shall live by faith. Well, Paul quotes that in Romans, doesn't he? It is written, the righteousness of God is revealed from faith. As it is written, the righteous man shall live by faith. That's a quote from Habakkuk 2:4. So you're going to want to make note of that it's quoted here in Romans, talking about righteousness of God revealed from faith to faith. And so you'd want to make comment there. I believe it's also in Hebrews, what chapter? 10. Yeah, Hebrews 10. It's also quoted. My righteous one shall live by faith. Okay, so you may have times where your passage is directly quoted, or it could be alluded to or seemingly referred to in the New Testament. All right, so you're just going to want to probably one tool that you could probably use is the Treasury of Scripture Knowledge. So for example, let me show you that. If you're not sure, you're trying to find, is my passage referred to somewhere else? Well, let's say you have, you're in, let's see, you're in Habakkuk chapter 2. see. It's the easiest way to. I think what the easiest way to. Yeah. See this TSK here? You guys see that? That's the Treasury of Scripture knowledge. So if you go to your passage, okay, so I'm interested in Hebrews 2:4. Let's say that's my passage. Then I hit TSK, Treasury of Scripture knowledge. And then notice here, for the words, there should be yeah, here it is. But, so the words following but, then there's some passages that they connect or link to it. And here, notice Romans 1:17, Galatians 3:11, and Hebrews 10:38 has it. It's quoted there. So if you go to your passage and just hit the TSK, then it'll give passages that are could be quotes or alluding to your passage. Not necessarily, but they'll just give passages that they think the Treasury of Scripture knowledge thinks might be related. Okay, that's their opinion. But when you do that, you may notice, this is a direct quote. As it is written, the righteous will live by faith. That's a direct quote. Okay, these other passages are not direct quotes, but could be allusions to it. So you're just going to want to take a look and see. Okay. All right. So those are the steps for prophetic analysis. I wanted to just go through a Obadiah example with you. But before I do that, do you guys have any questions? All right, I'll just get to it then. Okay. All right, well, for the sake of time, let's see, we've read through this passage, this book before. I just want to focus our attention on, let's say that you were studying this Obadiah and you just want to focus on the last part, verses 15 to 21. So we're just going to do the passage, prophetic analysis for those verses, okay? Not the whole book, just for the sake of time. Okay, so to do that, let's go ahead and I'm going to ask you guys to read just verses 15 to 21. So if I could get, let's see, Pastor Arn, if you could read for me verses 15 to 18, and then James, if you could read 19 to 21.
Okay. Verses 15 to 18. For the day of the Lord draws near on all nations. As you have done, it will be done to you. Your dealings will return on your own head, because just as you drank on my holy mountain, and the nation will drink continually, they will drink and swallow and become as they had never existed. But on Mount Zion, there will be those who escape, and it will be holy, and the house of Jacob will be possessed their possessions. Then the house of Jacob will be a fire, and the house of Joseph a flame, but the house of Esau will be a stubble, and they will set them on fire and consume them, so that there will be no survivor of the house of Esau, for the Lord has spoken.
Verses 19 to 21. Then those of the Negev will possess the mountain of Esau, and those of the Shephelah, the Philistine plain, also they will possess the territory of Ephraim and the territory of Samaria, and Benjamin will possess Gilead. And the exiles of this host of the sons of Israel, who are among the Canaanites, as far as Sarepta, and the exiles of Jerusalem, who are separate, will possess the cities of the Negev. The deliverers will ascend Mount Zion to judge the mountain of Esau, and the kingdom will be the Lord's.
Great. Thank you. Okay, so we're just going to focus our attention on these verses. And the first step would be to read and observe the passage. So we would want to read through that passage several times again. Let's do this. And make observations. All right. So let's see. Why don't oh, it's weird. Okay, sorry about that. So why don't you take a moment, just take a minute, look through this passage again, and just make some general observations, and then we'll talk about those together. Just take a couple minutes to do that. All right, get you familiar with the text. Yes. Tone of judgment, verses 15 and 16. Good. All right, good. Michael, are you there? Do you have an observation? Are you there, Michael?
Hello, Pastor. Good morning.
Oh, hi. I can hardly hear you. Do you have an observation?
Tone of despair.
Tone of despair? Is that what you said?
Yes, Pastor.
Where do you see that? Is there a specific statement that you saw that in, or?
Verse 17, sir.
Okay. What about
It seems there is a remnant.
a remnant? Is that what you said?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Those who escape.
Yes, sir.
Okay. James, did you have something?
No. Well, what about verse 18? A blaze, a fire.
Yeah, fire is repeated, right?
Mm-mm.
Right. Fire, flame, fire, consume. Good. All right. I mean, Alan, you got one? An observation, question from the passage, or anything that stuck out to you? Oh,
There's a Yes, it's in verse 17, there's a remnant. And in verse 18, it seems like God would use Israel to be his rod of judgment on Esau, something like that.
Okay, good. Yeah. All right. Good. Okay. Well, that's the idea. Just take some time and look through. Here's a few that I had come up with, just thoughts that I had or observations from looking at the passage. I had a question like verses 19 and 20. What's the significance of these different locations? Is there any importance to them? That was a, sorry, I have to sneeze. Sorry, excuse me, I had to sneeze. So that was a question that came to my mind. In the background context, we had studied that Obadiah may have been written around 850 BC. So I just made the observation that that's the case, the day of the Lord here would be the first reference to in the prophets, the earliest reference. So these are just thoughts I had going through. So that, but the idea here is just, you're not interpreting so much, you're just, again, getting familiar. And now that you've, read the whole book, you have done the background and the contextual flow for the whole book, you should be, pretty familiar with the passage. So there may be other thoughts that come to your mind that maybe you didn't have before. Now that you know a little more about the book, when you go back and read this passage in preparation for the prophetic analysis. So that's the point, is to just get us more familiar with the specific passage we're studying. And then the next thing we're going to want to do is to perform the narrative or the poetic analysis on the passage. Okay, and so here, as we look at this this passage, would you say that there's narrative features here? Is there events being described like in a narrative, or characters or dialogue, or is it just basically a sermon? What do you guys think? What seems to be the type of genre being used here? Obviously, it's prophetic. He's speaking of future events, but sorry.
Sermon.
Yeah, it's a sermon. And it's a sermon using poetic language, right? He's got these images. There's some figurative language here. He's describing Jacob as a fire. He talks about drinking on his holy mountain. There's these images of judgment. So this appears to be, I would characterize it as a sermon that uses poetic language. Okay. If you go all the way back to the beginning of the book, right? Vision of Obadiah, thus says the Lord concerning Edom. And then he pronounces this message against Edom. So it's really like a sermon. It's not a narrative at all. Now Obadiah is speaking, but he's not having a dialogue with somebody. There's not, some events that happen in Obadiah's life. He's simply declaring a message that he has been given. Okay. But he's in declaring that message, there's poetic elements that he uses. And so that means we would need to do a poetic analysis on the passage. And that means identify any imagery or parallelism or poetic devices that we see in the text. Okay. You guys following me? So we're just noticing there's poetic features here. So we want to, from what we've learned, before about poetry, we want to apply that understanding to examining this this passage. We'll get to the prophetic stuff in a little bit, but first we want to examine the poetic features. And so if you remember, imagery is one thing that poetry uses. Do you guys see any images here in these verses? Like any pictures being described?
Drunk on holy mountain.
Yeah, this image of drinking on Mount Zion. Now it seems, or he calls it Holy Mountain, right? Which a reference right to the Temple Mount, but it's kind of, so there's this almost picture of drinking like in celebration, right? We've seen that in other Old Testament passages. So maybe a picture of celebration, at least in the first part. But then it's like they will drink continually, so, and then they'll become as if they never existed. It almost sounds like it turns into judgment, doesn't it? Kind of an odd picture. Okay, are there any other images that you see here? You guys mentioned one in your observations, actually.
There's a fire, a flame, stubble.
Yeah, a picture of fire, right? We might say a consuming fire, right?
Yeah.
Edom is all right. Good. Any other pictures being described that you can see? How about verses 19 and 20? What's the image there? Or what's being described?
Is it invasion?
Perhaps, or at least, yeah, it's describing the Israel possessing again the land, right? You know, we could put a question mark. But the picture is they are repossessing the land from those around them. Okay. Okay.
Territory.
Yeah, territory. Good. All right. So that's one feature. You want to identify the images. Did someone have a comment? Secondly, or next, we want to consider the parallelism. Again, that's a poetic device or feature. So we want to ask, if you remember, right, when we looked at parallelism for your poetic passages, we're going to want to look through these verses and see if there seems to be any parallelism being used here. Now notice most of these verses are at least 3 lines. Verse 15 is 3, verse 16 is 4, 17 is 3, verse 18 is 6. So there's a lot of Coca-Colas in here, right? No bicolas, some tricolas, 3 lines, but mostly 4 or more. So again, prophetic texts don't always use parallelism. So don't, usually in the Psalms or Proverbs, definitely. But in prophetic passages, it's not as common, but we do see it. And I think there are some examples of it here. We won't go through every verse, but maybe just do a couple of them. Okay, as we look at verse 15, for example. The day of the Lord draws near on all nations. As you have done, it will be done to you. Your dealings will return on your own head. Now, looking at these lines, do we see any parallelism here potentially? Anybody? And again, oh, sorry. Remember the types here. Synonymous, that's both lines say the same thing. Contrastive, developmental, right? Where one line develops the other, and it could be one of three ways: by adding, by illustrating, by purpose or result. It could be unknown. And then sometimes a synonymous or contrastive will also be a chiasm, where the order of the words is switched. But any, yeah, Noor.
As you have done, it will be done to you.
That's one line. So does that line seem to have any parallelism with another line, the first or the third line?
Second and third, sir.
Second and third, yeah. What kind do you think?
As you have done your dealing, it's
Yeah,
the same.
yeah, I think
will
it.
be-
So what would that be?
Amen.
Yeah, I think it is. As you have done your dealings, it will be done to you. Will return on your head.
Yes.
I think you're right. Okay, good. How about, let's look at verse 16. This one's a little more complicated. What do you guys think?
All the nation will drink continually, and they will drink and swallow.
What does that look like? Yeah, I think so.
Synonym.
I think so. Yeah. How about lines 1 and 2? Because, there's a key word, just as you drank on my holy mountain. all the-
Reasons or result.
Yeah, I think line 2 developed, line 1, sorry, develops line 2.
Because
Or by reason, actually, right? Why all the nations will drink continually? Because you drank on my holy mountain. And then I would say here, line 4 develops line 3 by result. They will drink and swallow, and that will result in they never. So that's just my thought. Let's see. Let's try verse 19 here. You guys see anything here?
The ellipsis.
Yeah, there's definitely ellipsis. Good. What's being omitted here?
Will possess.
Yes. Will possess is omitted from line 2, right?
Yes.
Okay. It's implied that it's here, right?
Yes.
And then notice actually it is included in line 4, but what do we see there? What's the font here in line 4? Do you remember when we talked about italics in the translation?
Oh,
What do the italics here tell us?
It's not
Additional
there
by
in
the
the original.
translator.
Yeah, so actually, the New American Standard just put it in. But really, they should have left it out, because that's what the poet did. Because he's using ellipsis again there.
Ellipsis again.
Yeah. So we would say also again, will possessed is omitted from line 4 as well, even though the New American Standard adds. All right, so pay attention to that. So that really isn't in line 4 either in the original, but they added it in. Let's see, the LSB. Yeah, the LSB did the same thing. The ESV put it in, but again, they don't tell you if they add it. And notice, by the way, guys, what do we see in the second line? The ESV also added it there, didn't they? But it's not in the original. So that's why I like using the New American Standard for that reason, or the LSB, because they'll put in italics whenever they add a word in there that's not in the original. Anyway, so ellipsis is used. Do we see any parallelism here in verse 19? Possible parallelism?
That's synonymous.
Yeah, which lines?
One
Line 1 and line 2 in verse 19.
Yep, good. Yep, they're exactly synonymous. Synonymous. Okay. Very good. You guys see any others?
Line 3 and 4.
Are also synonymous, right?
Yes.
And then I would say line 3 adds to line 2 by expansion. So he's adding another. Those of the Shephelah will possess, and they will possess the territory of.
From the word also.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Good. We won't do all of them, but that's I'll put in my notes. I'll put what I have for all the verses, but this is just to give you a sample. Okay. All right. Very good. So we'd also want to continue looking for the poetic devices now being used within the poem or the message. But what I think I'm going to do, let's see. I know Christmas is coming up here. Are you guys available next Tuesday morning to get together, or do you have plans?
I'm available.
So who would not be available? Just let me see here. Who could not meet next week? So you all could be available, because we are going to take a break for a few weeks. But I did want to try to get this assignment review done, so at least we would have that done before Christmas. So I was thinking maybe if we could meet for maybe an hour next Tuesday morning at this time, would that be okay?
yes.
Okay.
I will.
Okay. Well, let's do that, and then we'll go through the rest of this assignment rather than try to go fast and cover everything. The example, I'd rather not do that, and then that way we'll have covered all the first 4 written assignments for you for Christmas, and you'll have a few weeks before we meet again in middle of January, okay? So yeah, let's go ahead and do that then. Write that on my, we'll meet at the same time on December 20th. Okay? And then I'll try to, hopefully we'll just go for an hour, so we won't do a full.
Or
Yeah,
Pastor, uh, I will, but December 20 is already scheduled with our family day in our school.
oh, okay.
But I will after my preaching.
Okay, well, if you can't make it, I understand, but
Pastor Tim,
yeah,
also we have we will actually fetch my daughter from the airport.
oh, okay.
Yes,
Would you,
on 20 December. So
on
if I
20th?
can join, I will just, I think, join you while we're there somewhere and just listen.
Okay. All right, well, let's do that. Like I said, we'll try to do a shorter class. I don't want to rush through the rest of the example here. Let's try to get it done in the next 10 minutes. But I think it'd be better to just have another session, just to take an hour or so, cover the rest of it, and then we'll take a break for a few weeks, okay? All right. All right, good. Well, I'll let you guys go. If you could pray for me